Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery for another sutta study. We'll start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll go through the Dhammapada verses for this morning. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So I'll be picking up again with some more Dhammapada verses. So today we'll be looking at Dhammapada verses 76 and 77. So these are some very famous verses, and they're ones that I particularly like to quote often. They also point to a very important aspect of Buddhist practice, and especially to monastic training. So I'll go ahead and read through the suttas and give some explanation referring to the Pali text as relevant, and then I'll take any questions that you might have. So as usual, please keep track of your questions, and I'll take them at the end. So these verses are from the Pandita Vagga, so the chapter about the wise, chapter on wise people. So the verse 76 begins, the Buddha says, like a person who leads you to hidden treasure. This is how to see a person who points out your faults. A wise person who tells you what you need to subdue is the kind of person you should associate with. Associating with that kind of person is always for the better and never for the worse. So that's verse 76. And then verse 77 is a continuation of that. It says, a person might advise you, instruct you, and keep you away from what is not good. They are liked by those who are good and not liked by those who are not good. So that's verse 77. So a couple of very short verses on the same topic, which is the topic of receiving constructive criticism. So admonishment, instruction. Usually when one is not interested in Buddhist practice, then to have somebody else point out your faults is painful, upsetting. We might perceive it as insulting, or rude or disrespectful or hostile. But in Buddhism, we're actually very interested in learning about our faults. We really want to know all of our faults because it's through knowing our faults that we can fix them. So this also, it's pointing back to a very critical aspect of Buddhist thought, which is the idea that nothing in our mind is indelible. Everything can be changed. So if somebody points out a fault, they're not attacking us because our faults are not who we are. Rather, they're pointing out something that can be cleaned. So it's kind of like if you have a nice white robe and you splash a little bit of beet juice on it, and one of your friends points out, oh, friend, you've got a little red stain on that nice white robe of yours. Maybe you should clean your robe. What do? Do we get angry? Do we get upset? Do we get offended? Are we insulted? No, you just washed the robe. Like, why would you be insulted? In fact, you'd be grateful. And maybe you didn't realize that you had this red blotch on your robe. And it's like, oh, thank you, friend. Thank you for pointing out the stain so that now that I know about the stain, I can clean it up. I can take care of this problem. And the Buddha goes one step further. He says you should see this as like someone who points out hidden treasure. It's like a guide to hidden treasure. Somebody who's pointing out something valuable but which is not immediately apparent. So again, this is, it's because what they're pointing out is the path to awakening. So when somebody comes up to you and says, "Oh, friend, I noticed you've been very grumpy today. How's your metta practice doing? Is your metta meditation going as well as it used to? Are you having some difficulty in your practice?" So what is that person doing? They're helping show you the next step on the path to awakening, which is the most valuable gift that you can give to another person. So the Buddha says that we should appreciate the sort of people who points out our faults to us. So responding with "thank you," and "yes, I'll try to improve." Maybe even ask for suggestions, advice about how to handle the difficulty you're faced with. The more help we can get, the better. So the Buddha says a wise person who tells you what you need to subdue is the kind of person you should associate with. In other words, we should make an effort to spend time with wise people who tell us what we need to work on. It's actually not so great if you just hang out with we used to call them yes men. I don't know if we still use that term anymore. Yeah, like people who, no matter what, they're just like, "You're great, you're perfect, you're totally fine, yep, everything's great." It's like, well, no, it's not. It's not great. Because if it was great, we would all be fully enlightened. Then we would all be having a great. But we're not fully enlightened. Therefore, there's still something wrong. So the biggest favor we can do for each other is to help each other find out where there's still work to be done on our minds. And so the Buddha says associating with that kind of person is always for the better and never for the worse. In other words, you can only be improved by spending time with people who point out your faults. Now, he does emphasize here a wise person. So spending time with a wise person who points out your faults. So this also is important because foolish people, people whose priorities are not Dhamma, or whose clarity of mind is not sharp enough to know what's good and what's bad, they might say things that they think are pointing out our faults, but which are actually contrary to Dhamma. So that is something you need to be attentive to as well. I remember a while back, someone came to me with a list of criticisms, ways that they thought I needed to improve my conduct. But most of the items on their list were actually contrary to Dhamma. It was coming from that person's opinions and perspectives, but those opinions and perspectives were not rooted in Buddhism. So the advice that was being offered was something that might have been relevant to somebody who wasn't Buddhist and maybe had a very different set of values and priorities. But in the context of Buddhism, it was irrelevant and even counterproductive in many ways. So again, the Buddha here, he's not saying that we should just blindly believe whatever criticism people give us. He doesn't say that we should just blindly follow whatever advice anybody offers us. But rather, he says we should seek out wise people to give us instruction, and wise people who will offer constructive criticism that we can then follow to improve ourselves. That said, even if criticism is coming from someone who's not particularly wise, we should still make an effort to reflect on our own conduct and really ask ourselves, am I acting in accordance with Dhamma? Or if you're a monastic, am I acting in accordance with Dhamma and Vinaya? So sometimes criticism is coming from a foolish person, but there's some element of truth to what they're saying. Like there is some amount of accordance with Dhamma in what they're saying. And by carefully reflecting on our own conduct, then we can see where there's some progress that can be made, where we can work to improve our own mind, our own conditions. So it's important not to be too quick to reject the advice that we receive, but rather to really deeply reflect. Is this advice in line with Dhamma? Is this something that will support me on the path to awakening? And again, the Buddha says that a person who advises us, instructs us, and helps to keep us away from harmful things, um, this kind of person is liked by good people, but disliked by people who are not good. In other words, people who are committed to the path of goodness like to receive advice and instruction and training from those who are ahead of them on the path. But people who are not committed to goodness actually really dislike it when they get criticized. Even if that criticism is in line with Dhamma, they find it offensive and upsetting, insulting, disrespectful. So again, we're trying to be good people. We're trying to be people who are committed to the path of awakening. Appreciating it when others offer instruction and training. Again, this is especially true in monastic life. So in monastic life, we rely very strongly upon the training that we get from senior monastics. But also as lay people rely on the training they get from monastic teachers, the guidance that helps keep them pointed in the right direction. So those are just a few words on these short verses. So I don't have too much to say this morning. They're relatively straightforward verses. So at this time, I'd be happy to take any questions or comments that you might have. So hello to all the friends joining in today. So hello to Maria, Gita, Sud, Jayanta, Charles Lee, John, Amaranta, Ja, Niranjan, Si Yong, Nawang, Jan, Raul, and Janaki. Welcome everyone. And I don't see any questions from online. Any questions from the residents here? No. Okay. So if there's no questions, then we might have a short session this morning. So Gita says, thank you for sharing Dhammapada. Well, I think it's delightful, Gita, that you're joining in day after day. So we see you pretty much every session. So it's really delightful, your commitment to learning the Dhamma and discussing the Dhamma. It's really admirable because this is the basis of the arising of wisdom, is to constantly come back to reading the suttas, discussing the suttas, learning about the Dhamma. This is the way that we make progress on the path. Yeah, so I don't see any questions. So I think here's a question. So Sud asks, how can one seek out someone who is able to point us in the right direction? It is so difficult in this day and age to be exposed to other practitioners who are sincere. Go to monasteries. And in particular, go to monasteries which put a lot of value on meditation practice, on sutta study, and if they're monastics who also have some respect for Vinaya. So basically, seek out monastics who take the Buddha's advice seriously and are really trying to live in accordance with the Buddha's instructions. And get your advice and instruction from them. It's not always so easy, depending on where you live. It's not always easy to go in person, but these days with the internet, you have much broader access. But yeah, that's basically my advice to you is seek out monasteries which place a lot of value on meditation practice, sutta study, and on Vinaya, and learn from those monastics. And Michael asks, what about the case of good advice from a person from whom we are, for whatever reason, not prepared to take advice, such as someone who attempts to lord it over you? Yeah, that's more challenging. So if it's a matter of our own internal resistance, then we need to look at ourselves and ask ourselves why we're resistant to the advice. Sometimes we're resistant to advice because we're not interested in change. We're not interested in changing that aspect of our behavior. Or we're upset with the advice being offered because, again, we take it personally. We think that's a part of our personality and therefore not subject to change. So in that case, it's coming from wrong view. But you mentioned the case of someone who attempts to lord it over you. So this is where someone who's offering advice, but they're doing so in an unskillful way, an unwholesome way. And interestingly enough, there's a sutta, and I can look up the reference later, but there's a sutta where, as I recall, it's Venerable Sariputta talking about giving and receiving admonishment. And he actually says, like, if somebody admonishes you incorrectly, such as speaking at the wrong time or saying something that's not beneficial or speaking harshly or speaking with aversion or saying something, even something that's not true, then Sariputta says, then you can actually think to yourself, I have no reason to be ashamed because the person who's admonishing me is doing so incorrectly. So then you can reflect. It's like, okay, I'm actually blameless here. I'm not the one who's doing something wrong. But we should still reflect on whether or not there's any value or truth to what the person is saying. And try to look past the rude or inappropriate conduct. Try to look past the wrong way the person is speaking and see if there's anything valuable in what they're saying. So one of the recommendations the Buddha makes in the suttas, he uses an image of a monk who is wandering along the road and he sees a piece of cloth lying on the ground. And most of the cloth is stained and ragged, but there's one piece of it that's still in good condition. It's relatively clean and solid fabric. So he says the monk will gently stretch out the fabric with his foot and tear off the part that's usable and take it with him when he goes. And he leaves behind all of the stained and ragged bits of cloth. So in the same way, like when somebody's offering instruction, maybe they're doing so in a very rude and hostile and inappropriate way. Nonetheless, we should still be looking to see if there's anything of value in what they're saying, and trying to look past the hostility or the rudeness of what they're saying. That said, if somebody is actually using admonishment as a form of attack, then that also means you should question their wisdom. So somebody who's using admonishment as an attack they might be a little bit lacking an understanding of the Buddha's teachings. But the other thing is sometimes it's not actually that the person is trying to be hostile, but rather that's what we're perceiving. So sometimes it's also a matter of our own distorted perception. And Michael also says, or someone with whom you simply feel uncomfortable. Well, in that case, you just need to reflect on your own discomfort and get over it. You're going to feel uncomfortable with a lot of people in this life. So at some point, you just need to get over it and learn how to be more comfortable with people. And Michael further clarifies, I can take the advice while reflecting on my own feelings regarding the giver of the advice. Yeah, that is an important part of it. Again, we should always be looking to see if there's anything useful in the advice that's being given. So in the example I gave earlier of the person who gave a list of non-Buddhist recommendations to me, I still carefully went through the list to see if there was anything in there that was useful in accordance with Dhamma. And there actually were a couple things where I was like, oh, that's a good point. So we should always make the effort to see if there is something valuable in there. Because sometimes there is. It's like finding hidden treasure. You're like looking in a trash heap and you see a gold ring and you're like, wow, If I had just walked past it thinking it was all trash, I would never have found this precious treasure. But you take a closer look and you start to realize sometimes there's a little bit of gold mixed in with all that trash. So that's the last of the questions from online. And hello, Aya Brahmavara. Good to see you, Venerable. Looking forward to seeing you at the monastery soon. And anything from the residents? No? Okay, so we'll go ahead and end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And this evening we'll have our usual weekly monk chat. So please bring all of your random Buddhist questions and we'll answer them this evening.